January 17, 1943. The USS Essex sits dead in the water, 300 miles from safety, Japanese submarines circling, and deep in the engine room, an engineer stares at a crack that shouldn't exist. The propeller blade has shattered. Bronze, the same alloy that's driven warships for centuries, has failed. And America has a problem that courage alone cannot solve. We've run out of tin. Without tin, there's no bronze. Without bronze, there are no propellers. Without propellers, the entire Pacific Fleet becomes an anchor around the neck of a drowning nation. Then someone suggests the unthinkable. Across America, churches receive a request: donate your bells. Those centuries-old bronzes that rang out over baptisms and weddings and funerals. Melt them down. Turn them into weapons, and they did. Communities voted to sacrifice their history, to send the voices of their faith into the fire. What emerged were propeller blades that would carry the free world to victory. This is the story of America had no magnesium in 1941. 1943. Aboard the USS Essex, South Pacific, the propeller shaft hummed beneath the steel deck plating. A steady, droning vibration that every man aboard had learned to ignore, until the day it stopped. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Commander Raymond Kellerman stood in the engine room, his coveralls stained black with grease, staring at the bronze propeller blade that had cracked clean through. The fracture line gleamed dully under the work lamps, a wound in metal that should never have opened. Around him, the heat was oppressive, the air thick with diesel fumes and the metallic tang of seawater seeping through the hull. The Essex, one of America's newest fleet carriers, was dead in the water 300 miles from any friendly port, and the Japanese submarine wolf packs were circling. Kellerman ran his fingers along the fracture. Bronze. The same alloy that had driven warships since the age of sail. Copper and tin, forged under tremendous heat, shaped into blades that could push 50,000 tons of steel through angry seas at 30 knots. But in January 1943, bronze was a memory. The strategic reserves were exhausted. Every scrapyard in America had been picked clean. The tin mines of Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, sources of nearly 90% of the world's tin supply, were in Japanese hands. And without tin, there was no bronze. Without bronze, there were no propellers. Without propellers, the United States Navy was an anchor chain wrapped around the neck of a drowning nation. The war in the Pacific was being fought on a knife's edge. Every carrier, every destroyer, every transport ship was a calculated risk against an enemy that had spent a decade preparing for this exact conflict. The Imperial Japanese Navy had stockpiled materials, trained crews, and built a doctrine around swift, decisive strikes. They had expected the Americans to collapse after Pearl Harbor, to sue for peace before the summer of 1942. They had been wrong about American resolve. But resolve does not forge propeller blades. Resolve does not replace a cracked shaft bearing or fabricate a rudder assembly. And in the opening months of 1943, as the Allies began their slow, grinding offensive across the Pacific, the United States was facing a crisis that no amount of courage could solve. The problem was elemental. Modern naval propellers required a specific alloy. Manganese bronze, an amalgam of copper, tin, zinc, and manganese that could withstand the crushing pressures of deep water, the corrosive bite of salt, and the relentless torque of engines generating tens of thousands of horsepower. Copper was plentiful. American mines in Montana and Arizona were running triple shifts. Zinc could be sourced domestically. Manganese could be imported from Brazil and South Africa. But tin was the ghost in the formula. Without it, the alloy fractured. Without it, propeller blades shattered under load, leaving ships stranded and vulnerable. By the winter of 1943, the United States Maritime Commission had issued a quiet directive to every naval shipyard and repair facility in the country: find an alternative, or watch the Pacific Fleet rust at anchor. In the engineering labs of the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., and at MIT's Metallurgy Department in Cambridge, scientists were working double shifts to solve a problem that seemed insurmountable. They tested aluminum alloys too soft, prone to cavitation damage. They experimented with high-carbon steel too brittle, vulnerable to stress fractures. They tried nickel-based superalloys too expensive, too slow to manufacture, and requiring materials that were themselves in short supply. Every test ended the same way: a fractured blade, a failed simulation, a report marked unsuitable for combat deployment. But in a small workshop in Baltimore, a civilian contractor named Theodore Rosenbaum was approaching the problem from a different angle. Rosenbaum was not a metallurgist by training. He was a sculptor, a man who had spent 30 years casting church bells for parishes across the eastern seaboard. He understood bronze in a way that engineers did not: as a formula on paper, but as a living material with memory, with grain structure, with secrets that revealed themselves only under the hammer and the flame. And when the Navy came to him in desperation, asking if there was any way to repurpose old bronze into propeller-grade alloy, he said yes. The plan was audacious. Across America, churches were being asked to donate their bells, centuries-old bronzes that had rung out over baptisms and weddings and funerals, that had marked the hours of small-town life since before the Revolution. These bells were not pure bronze. They were bell metal, an alloy rich in copper but also containing traces of tin, zinc, lead, and arsenic, mixed in proportions that gave each bell its unique voice. The chemistry was inconsistent. The purity was questionable. But it was bronze, and it was available, and in the winter of 1943, that was enough. The first shipment arrived at the Baltimore foundry in February. Rosenbaum stood in the snow, watching as workers unloaded bells from flatbed trucks, massive bronzes weighing half a ton each, their surfaces etched with inscriptions in Latin and English, their clappers removed and tagged with the names of parishes in Pennsylvania and Virginia and the Carolinas. There was something profane about it, he thought, something that felt like sacrilege. These bells had called the faithful to prayer for generations. They had rung out the end of the First World War. They had tolled for presidents and for paupers. And now they were being melted down to make weapons of war. But Rosenbaum was a pragmatist. He knew that sentiment had no place in the furnace. He knew that every day the Essex remained crippled was another day the Japanese could consolidate their hold on the Solomon Islands. Another day American Marines went without air cover, another day the war dragged on. So he ordered the bells fed into the crucibles, watched them glow white-hot under the flames, watched the metal liquefy and pool, watched the impurities rise to the surface in a black scum that was skimmed away and discarded. The challenge was standardization. Bell metal was a wildly inconsistent alloy. Some bells were 70% copper, others closer to 60%. The tin content varied by as much as 15%. There were trace elements: antimony, silver, even gold that no one had accounted for. Rosenbaum had to analyze each batch, calculate the adjustments, add measured quantities of pure copper and zinc to bring the chemistry into alignment with naval specifications. It was slow, painstaking work, and every batch was a gamble. But gradually, over weeks of trial and error, he began to produce ingots that met the Navy's minimum standards. The first propeller blade cast from church bell bronze was installed on a destroyer escort in March 1943. The ship was put through sea trials off the coast of Delaware, full speed runs, emergency stops, hard turns that pushed the propeller to its operational limits. The engineers watched the telemetry with clenched fists, waiting for the vibration signature that would indicate a developing fracture. It never came. The blade held. The alloy performed. And within a month, the foundries in Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland were running around the clock, casting propeller blades from melted church bells. Across the Pacific, the Japanese High Command remained unaware of the crisis that had nearly crippled the American fleet. Their intelligence networks had reported shortages of rubber and oil, delays in shipbuilding, and logistical bottlenecks at the Panama Canal. But they had not anticipated the bronze shortage, because they did not understand the American industrial machine. They saw a nation of soft, decadent civilians, a people who valued comfort over sacrifice, a culture that would break under sustained pressure. They could not imagine a country that would melt down its church bells to keep its warships running. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Navy had believed this narrative with every fiber of his being. He had been trained at Etajima Naval Academy, where instructors had drilled into him the superiority of Japanese discipline, the purity of Bushido, the inevitability of victory. He had read the reports from Pearl Harbor, seen the photographs of burning battleships, and convinced himself that America was finished. The war would be over by 1943. Japan would dominate the Pacific. The Emperor's divine will would be realized, but in the spring of 1943, Tanaka's destroyer was sunk by aircraft from the USS Essex during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. He spent 11 hours in the water, clinging to wreckage, watching his crewmates drown or succumb to exposure, before being pulled aboard an American destroyer escort. He was taken below decks, given dry clothes and hot soup, and placed under guard in a storage compartment. And it was there, in the belly of an American warship, that Tanaka first encountered the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life, the propeller. A deep, rhythmic thrum that resonated through the hull, steady and inexorable. It never wavered. It never faltered. It was the heartbeat of a machine that did not tire, did not hunger, did not fear. Tanaka pressed his ear to the bulkhead and listened, trying to understand how such power was possible. His own ship had been slower, less maneuverable, its engines prone to breakdowns and its crew exhausted from constant repairs. But this American vessel moved with mechanical perfection, as if the ocean itself had been tamed and bent to its will. When the war ended and Tanaka was repatriated to Japan, he carried that sound with him. In the prison camps, he had heard stories from other captive stories of American factories that produced a new bomber every hour, of shipyards that launched a Liberty ship every day, of arsenals that churned out shells and bullets and bombs in quantities that defied comprehension. He had dismissed these stories as propaganda, the exaggerations of broken men trying to rationalize their defeat. But the sound of that propeller had been real. The steady, unstoppable thrum of American industry had been real. And in the ruins of post-war Tokyo, as Tanaka tried to rebuild a life from the ashes of his faith, he found himself wondering what kind of nation could melt down its churches to build its navy. The church bell propellers became a classified secret. The Navy, acutely aware of the symbolic and psychological dimensions of the war, did not publicize the fact that American warships were being driven by metal forged from objects of worship. There were concerns about morale, about the optics of desecrating religious artifacts, about the potential for enemy propaganda. But within the engineering community, the achievement was recognized as a masterpiece of improvisation. It was not elegant. It was not planned. But it worked. By the end of 1943, more than 400 propeller blades had been cast from melted church bells. The alloy proved more durable than anyone had anticipated. The trace elements introduced by the bell's varied origins actually improved the metal's resistance to fatigue and corrosion. Some engineers speculated that the centuries of vibration, the constant ringing and resonance, had altered the grain structure of the bronze at a microscopic level, pre-stressing the material in ways that made it ideal for high-torque applications. It was an unproven theory, a romantic notion that had no place in peer-reviewed journals. But the blades performed, and performance was the only metric that mattered. The symbolic weight of the material was not lost on the sailors who served aboard those ships. Word spread, as it always does in close quarters, that the propellers driving them across the Pacific had once called congregations to prayer in Pennsylvania and Georgia and North Carolina. Some men found it unsettling, a violation of the sacred. Others saw it as a blessing, a literal embodiment of the idea that God was on their side. A chaplain aboard the Essex held a service in which he spoke of transformation, of swords beaten into plowshares and, in this case, of bells beaten into blades. He quoted Isaiah and Psalms and reminded the men that their cause was just, that the metal beneath their feet carried the prayers of generations, that every rotation of the propeller was a hymn sung in defiance of tyranny. It was theater, of course. Morale-building rhetoric designed to give meaning to suffering and sacrifice. But it worked. The men believed. And belief, in wartime, is a force multiplier more potent than steel. In the archives of the Naval Research Laboratory, there is a photograph taken in the summer of 1943. It shows Theodore Rosenbaum standing beside a newly cast propeller blade, his hands blackened with soot, his face lined with exhaustion. Behind him, stacked on wooden pallets, are the remnants of a dozen church bells, fragments of metal waiting to be fed into the furnace. The photograph is grainy, poorly lit, the kind of image that would never make it into a museum exhibit. But it captures something essential about the American war effort, the willingness to sacrifice, to improvise, to tear down the symbols of the past in order to build the tools of survival. Rosenbaum died in 1951, 8 years after the war ended. His obituary in the Baltimore Sun made no mention of the propellers, no reference to his role in keeping the Pacific Fleet operational. He was remembered as a bellmaker, a craftsman who had restored the carillons of cathedrals and cast the bells that rang out over small town squares. The classified nature of his wartime work meant that his greatest achievement went unrecognized, a footnote buried in naval procurement records and metallurgical reports that would not be declassified for another 30 years, but the bells themselves left a legacy. After the war, when the strategic tin reserves were replenished and bronze production returned to normal, the Navy quietly retired the church bell propellers. Some were scrapped, melted down once again and recast into peacetime applications. Others were preserved, stored in naval warehouses alongside other relics of the war. And a few, perhaps a dozen, were returned to the parishes that had donated them, recast into bells and hung once more in steeples across America. There is a church in rural Virginia where one such bell still rings. It was donated in 1943, melted down, cast into a propeller blade, and used aboard the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts during the battle off Samar. The ship survived one of the most desperate naval engagements of the war, trading blows with Japanese battleships and cruisers in a fight that should have ended in annihilation. When the war ended, the propeller was removed, and the bronze was returned to the parish. A local foundry recast it into a bell, and in 1947, it was hung once more in the steeple. The inscription reads, "In memory of those who served, 1943 to 1945. The bell rings every Sunday." Its tone is slightly different than it was before, deeper, richer, with a resonance that seems to carry farther than it should. Some attribute this to the recasting process, to changes in the alloy composition or the shape of the bell. But others believe that the metal carries memory, that the years spent driving a warship through hostile waters left a mark that cannot be erased. It is a fanciful notion, unscientific and unsupported by evidence. But it is believed nonetheless. The story of the church bell propellers is not well known. It does not appear in the popular histories of World War II, does not feature in the documentaries that air on cable television, does not form part of the national mythology of American triumph. It is too strange, too specific, too symbolic to fit neatly into the narratives we tell ourselves about the war. We prefer stories of heroism and sacrifice, of battles won and enemies vanquished. We are less comfortable with stories of improvisation and desperation, of a nation that came perilously close to losing simply because it ran out of tin. But it is precisely these stories that reveal the true nature of the American war effort. The United States did not win World War II because of superior strategy or unmatched bravery. It won because it was willing to do whatever was necessary, to sacrifice whatever was required, to transform itself in ways that its enemies could not imagine. The Japanese High Command believed that Americans were soft, that they valued their churches and their comforts too much to endure the hardships of total war. They were wrong. Americans valued their churches deeply. But they valued freedom more. The melting of the bells was not a grand gesture. It was not a moment of high drama or cinematic heroism. It was a quiet, pragmatic decision made by engineers and bureaucrats who understood that wars are won in foundries and factories, not just on battlefields. It was the work of men like Theodore Rosenbaum, who spent their days covered in soot and sweat, who transformed sacred objects into tools of survival, who carried the weight of that transformation without recognition or reward. And it was the work of communities across America, parishes that voted to donate their bells, that gathered in church basements and made the decision to send their history to the foundry. They did not do it for glory. They did it because their sons and brothers and fathers were dying in the Pacific, because every week brought news of another ship sunk or another island invaded, because the alternative was surrender. They gave what they had, and what they had was bronze. In the years after the war, as the Cold War took shape and the world settled into an uneasy peace, the symbolism of the church bell propellers took on new meaning. During the 1950s, as Soviet propagandists denounced American materialism and cultural decay, U.S. officials would occasionally reference the story, carefully, obliquely, as evidence of American moral fortitude. Here was a nation, they argued, that valued its ideals more than its idols, that was willing to sacrifice the symbols of faith in defense of freedom. It was a powerful narrative, one that played well in the ideological battles of the era. But the reality was more complex. The decision to melt the bells was born not of idealism but of desperation. It was an improvisation forced upon a nation that had entered the war unprepared, that had spent 2 decades neglecting its military and industrial base, that had been caught flat-footed by an enemy that understood the value of strategic resources. The church bell propellers were a triumph of American ingenuity, yes. But they were also a reminder of American vulnerability, of how close the nation had come to paralysis, of how much the outcome of the war depended on luck and improvisation. The Japanese officers who were captured and interrogated after the war were often asked about their perceptions of American industry. Their answers were remarkably consistent. They had expected the United States to be technologically advanced but spiritually weak, capable of producing material goods but incapable of enduring sacrifice. They had been trained to see Americans as individualists, as people who valued personal comfort over collective duty. The revelation that American communities had voluntarily donated their church bells, objects of profound cultural and religious significance, to be melted down for the war effort was incomprehensible to them. It violated every assumption they had been taught about the American character. Lieutenant Tanaka, in his post-war memoir, wrote about this moment of realization. He described lying in the storage compartment of the American destroyer, listening to the propeller's steady thrum, and feeling a kind of vertigo. Everything he had believed about the war, about the enemy, about the inevitability of Japanese victory, was revealed as a delusion. The Americans were not soft. They were not decadent. They were, in fact, the most ruthless and pragmatic enemy Japan had ever faced, willing to sacrifice anything, even the symbols of their faith, to achieve victory. It was a lesson that came too late to change the outcome of the war, but it haunted him for the rest of his life. The church bell propellers are a small footnote in the vast chronicle of World War II. They did not win the war. They did not turn the tide of any major battle, but they kept ships moving during a critical period when the alternative was paralysis. They represented a kind of alchemy, the transformation of the sacred into the functional, the melting down of history to forge the future. And they revealed something essential about the American way of war, a willingness to improvise, to adapt, to tear apart the structures of the past in order to build the tools of survival. In the end, wars are not won by the side with the best equipment or the most experienced soldiers. They are won by the side that can endure, that can adapt, that can find solutions when every rational option has been exhausted. The United States in 1943 was a nation running on fumes, scraping the bottom of its strategic reserves, one failed harvest or shipment away from crisis. But it did not collapse. It melted down its church bells. It cast propeller blades from the bronze that had once called the faithful to prayer. It sent those blades to sea aboard warships that carried the hopes of a free world. And it kept moving forward, one steady, unstoppable revolution at a time. The sound of those propellers, deep and rhythmic and inexorable, was the sound of a nation that refused to quit. It was the sound of sacrifice without grandeur, of ingenuity born from desperation, of a people who understood that freedom is not defended by speeches or symbols but by the willingness to transform anything, even the most sacred objects, into tools of survival. It was the sound of church bells ringing beneath the waves, a hymn sung in bronze and salt, a prayer answered not in words but in motion, and it was the sound of victory.